Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Yurchenko wrote his last letter home 2 weeks before he died. "The Israelis are competent," he told his wife in Kursk. "But they rely too much on American equipment and not enough on doctrine. When we finally engage them directly, it will be brief." He was right about one thing. It was brief. July 30th, 1970, 6:47 am, a Soviet MiG-21 erupts into a fireball over the Sinai Desert, then another, then three more, all within 180 seconds. 5 of the most elite fighter pilots on Earth, gone, not shot down by NATO, not ambushed by Americans, destroyed by a tiny air force that the Soviets had openly mocked for years. But here is what nobody talks about. The man who pulled off this ambush was not a general, not an admiral, not a politician in Tel Aviv. The man who designed the trap that destroyed 5 Soviet aircraft and shattered the myth of Soviet air supremacy was a 34-year-old intelligence analyst named Abraham Arnon. Working in a cramped operations room with captured Soviet radar manuals and a slide rule, his colleagues thought the plan was borderline suicidal. His own commanders called it reckless. One senior officer reportedly told him directly, "You are going to start World War III with this." He did not start World War III. He changed it. Stay with us. Because this story begins not in the sky, but with a humiliation so complete, so total, that a superpower sent its best pilots halfway around the world just to erase the memory of it. The year is 1967, 6 days. That is all it took. The Israeli Air Force destroyed the combined air forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Nearly 500 Arab aircraft obliterated. Most of them while still on the ground, engines cold, pilots asleep. In 132 hours of fighting, Israel seized the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. It was one of the most devastating military defeats in modern history, and in Moscow, the men in the Kremlin watched it happen on their radar screens in real time. The Arab air forces had been equipped, trained, and advised almost entirely by the Soviet Union. Their pilots flew Soviet jets, their missiles were Soviet, their radar systems, their tactics, their command structures. All of it Soviet, and in 6 days the Israelis had turned every single piece of it into wreckage and smoke. For the Soviet military, this was not just a political embarrassment. It was a direct challenge to the credibility of Soviet weapons and Soviet doctrine on the world stage. Every nation watching, every government in Africa, Asia, Latin America that had accepted Soviet military assistance. They were all asking the same question. If Soviet equipment could be destroyed that completely, that quickly, what exactly were they buying? Moscow could not let that question stand unanswered. By 1969, Egypt and Israel were locked in what became known as the War of Attrition. It had no dramatic land battles, no decisive breakthroughs. It was a grinding daily exchange of artillery fire, airstrikes, and commando raids along the Suez Canal. Egypt's President Nasser had one goal: bleed Israel slowly, wear down the Israeli defense forces, reclaim at least the psychological initiative after the disaster of 1967. The problem was that the Israeli Air Force was doing exactly the same thing back, and doing it better. Israeli Phantom jets began conducting deep penetration raids into Egypt itself, striking targets near Cairo, destroying radar installations, hitting military infrastructure that Egypt had spent years rebuilding. Egyptian air defenses, even with their Soviet-supplied Si-2 and Si-3 missile batteries, could not stop them. The psychological impact inside Egypt was devastating. Nasser, humiliated and desperate, flew secretly to Moscow in January 1970 and delivered a message to Soviet Premier Brezhnev that was essentially an ultimatum. Either send Soviet forces to defend Egypt directly, or Egypt would be forced to seek a separate peace with Israel. Brezhnev said yes. What followed was extraordinary. The Soviet Union deployed not advisors, not weapons shipments, not technical consultants. They deployed combat units, real ones. Between March and June of 1970, approximately 15,000 Soviet military personnel arrived in Egypt, including 3 complete air defense divisions. And critically, operational fighter squadrons of MiG-21 interceptors flown by active Soviet Air Force pilots. These were not rookies. These were veterans, men with thousands of flight hours. Men who had been trained in the most demanding conditions Soviet aviation could produce. They arrived with absolute confidence, and they had reason for it. The Soviet pilots did not share air bases with the Egyptians. They operated separately, south of Cairo. There was little interaction between the Russian and Egyptian pilots. And when there was, the tone was unmistakable. Contempt. The Soviets mocked the Egyptian pilots openly, called them incompetent, blamed Egypt's losses on lack of skill, not Israeli capability. You lost because you are bad pilots, they said, not because the Israelis are good. The Egyptians said nothing. They smiled, they nodded, and they remembered. Within weeks, Soviet pilots began flying combat air patrols over Egyptian territory. They shot down Israeli aircraft. They drew a line in the sky above the Suez Canal and dared Israel to cross it. The Soviets called it the Red Line. Cross it, and your jet disappears. Inside the Israeli Air Force, the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. Missions that had been routine became dangerous. Deep strike operations were scaled back. On June 30th, 1970, 2 Israeli Phantoms were shot down by Soviet-directed surface-to-air missiles, not Egyptian crews, Soviet crews, and the message was clear. The rules had changed. In Tel Aviv, in Washington, in every capital watching the region, the same conclusion was forming. The Soviet Air Force now owned the sky over the Suez Canal. And if that remained true, the military balance in the entire Middle East would tilt permanently toward Moscow. That was the problem. Enormous, existential, and seemingly unsolvable. And then there was Abraham Arnon. He was not a pilot. He had never flown a MiG-21 or engaged in a dogfight. His domain was intelligence, specifically signals intelligence and the technical analysis of Soviet military systems. He was the kind of man who spent his evenings cross-referencing captured Soviet radar manuals with intercepted radio frequencies, building in his mind a precise model of exactly how Soviet ground-controlled interception worked. He was meticulous to the point of obsession. Colleagues remembered him as the man who would interrupt a briefing to correct a minor technical detail about radar pulse repetition frequency. He was not popular at parties. He had few friends. He ate lunch alone, usually at his desk, surrounded by charts and printouts and notebooks filled with calculations in tiny, precise handwriting. But he understood Soviet air doctrine at a molecular level, and in the summer of 1970, that understanding was worth more than any weapon Israel possessed. What Arnon had identified through months of painstaking analysis was a fundamental architectural flaw in the Soviet interception system, not in the aircraft, not in the missiles, but in the system of trust that held everything together. Soviet pilots trusted their ground controllers completely. This was by design. The GCI system, ground-controlled interception, was built on the premise that radar operators on the ground had a clearer, more comprehensive picture of the battlefield than any individual pilot in the air. Soviet pilots were trained to follow vectors from the ground, to climb when told to climb, to engage when told to engage. The ground saw everything the pilot executed. And this made Soviet pilots extraordinarily precise in controlled environments. It also made them potentially blind in uncontrolled ones, because if the ground saw what someone wanted them to see, if the radar picture could be shaped, manipulated, constructed, then the pilots would fly directly into whatever that picture suggested. Not because they were stupid, because they were disciplined, because the entire system was built on the assumption that the radar told the truth. Arnon's idea was to make the radar lie. Here is how it worked, explained in the simplest possible terms. When a radar beam hits a single aircraft, it returns a signal of a certain size. That size is called the radar cross-section. A MiG-21 returns a small signal. A large transport aircraft returns a much larger one. Soviet radar operators were trained to identify targets partly by the size of that return. A small, fast return was a fighter. A large, slow return was something bigger, a reconnaissance plane, a transport, a high-value target that would be practically undefended now. What happens if you take 4 fighters and fly them in such a precise, tight formation that their radar returns completely overlap? What the Soviet radar sees is not 4 small returns. It sees one enormous return, one giant, slow-moving blip that looks exactly like a large reconnaissance aircraft flying a standard intelligence-gathering mission, the kind of target that Soviet pilots would scramble to intercept immediately. Confidently, certain that what they were chasing was essentially defenseless, Arnon proposed flying 4 Mirage 2Is in precisely this formation, so tight, so disciplined. that the separation between aircraft was measured not in hundreds of feet, but in dozens. The pilots would have to maintain this formation for extended periods, at altitude, under pressure, without breaking the radar illusion. If even one aircraft drifted too far from the others, the blip would split on Soviet screens, and the deception would collapse. When Arnon presented this plan, the reaction was not enthusiastic. The first objection was physical. Flying that close to another aircraft at altitude for an extended period was genuinely dangerous. One moment of inattention, one patch of unexpected turbulence, and two jets could collide. The pilots themselves, when briefed on the required separation distances, exchanged looks that said everything. The second objection was strategic. If this operation went wrong, if Soviet pilots were shot down, if Soviet pilots were killed, the diplomatic consequences were completely unpredictable. Israel would be directly killing Soviet military personnel. That could mean anything. It could mean Soviet retaliation. It could mean a direct superpower escalation. It could mean, as one senior officer actually said, the beginning of a much larger war. The third objection came from the fighter pilot community itself. Colonel Giora Epstein, 28 years old, 13 confirmed kills, 6 years flying the Mirage 3. He was everything Arnon was not. Confident, charismatic, respected by every pilot in the Air Force. And he did not trust intelligence analysts. Epstein stood at the back of the briefing room, arms crossed, listening to Arnon explain the formation geometry, the radar cross-section manipulation, the GCI deception. When Arnon finished, Epstein spoke. "You designed an operation that puts our pilots 40 feet from each other at 35,000 feet, based on your reading of Soviet manuals." Arnon nodded. "Why?" Epstein said slowly. "Should we trust a man who has never flown a combat mission to understand what happens inside a cockpit?" The room went quiet. Arnon did not answer immediately. He walked to the chart on the wall, a Soviet radar modification log, intercepted June 9th. He pointed to a specific data entry. "Because I am the one reading their mail," he said. "And right now their mail says they have identified every tactic we have used in the last 6 months. They have modified their procedures. They are rotating their radar operators on 4-hour shifts instead of 8, specifically to maintain alertness." He turned to face Epstein. "They adapted. The question is whether we adapt faster." Epstein studied the chart for a long moment. Then he looked at Arnon with an expression that was not quite respect, but was in the same neighborhood. "What exactly are you asking my pilots to do?" Arnon explained. "4 Mirage eyes. Flying in formations so tight that from the ground, from above, and most critically from Soviet radar scopes, they would appear as a single aircraft. They would cross into Egyptian airspace at high altitude, slow, deliberate. On Soviet screens they would look like a fat, slow reconnaissance plane, practically begging to be intercepted. Soviet MiGs would scramble. Fast, confident, and when they were fully committed, far from the safety of their own airspace, descending into the kill zone, the ambush force would climb, F-4 Phantoms and additional Mirages. Flying at extremely low altitude, below the minimum elevation angles of Soviet radar, invisible until the moment they were not." Epstein listened without interruption. When Arnon finished, Epstein asked one question. "How confident are you?" Arnon met his eyes. "More confident than I have ever been about anything in my life." The objections continued for weeks. Senior officers pushed back. The Air Force Command requested additional analysis. The Defense Minister demanded assurances that could not be given. But slowly, with modifications, with additional safeguards, with the explicit approval of the highest levels of Israeli military command, the plan was approved. And the training began. The pilots selected for the bait formation were not chosen randomly. They were the most disciplined formation flyers in the Israeli Air Force. Men who had spent hundreds of hours practicing close formation work until the movements were automatic. Instinctive, they trained the specific formation Arnon required. 4 Mirages flying so tight that their wingtips were separated by less than 50 feet. They flew the route dozens of times. They rehearsed the specific altitude profiles, the specific headings, the specific timing that would present the most convincing radar signature to Soviet ground controllers. Every detail was mapped against Arnon's model of exactly how Soviet GCI teams would respond. Meanwhile, the ambush force, F-4 Phantoms and additional Mirage, rehearsed their own role. They would fly at extremely low altitude, below the minimum elevation angles of Soviet radar, threading through the terrain features of the Sinai that Anand's team had mapped with obsessive care. They would wait, invisible to Soviet screens, until the precise moment when the MiGs were fully committed to their intercept. Then they would climb. 3 weeks of preparation, hundreds of training sorties, dozens of briefings, revisions, arguments, and refinements. And on the morning of July 30th, 1970, it was ready. The 4 Mirage pilots climbed into their cockpits before dawn. The ambush force positioned itself low and quiet over the eastern Sinai. In the operations room, Anand and his team watched their radar screens, tracking the Soviet patrol patterns, looking for the moment when the conditions aligned perfectly. At 6:42 a.m., the bait formation crossed into Egyptian airspace and began its slow, deliberate climb to 35,000 feet. On Soviet radar screens, a single large blip appeared, moving north, moving slow, moving exactly like something worth chasing. In the Soviet GCI center, a controller leaned toward his scope. His hand moved toward the radio. The MiGs were already warming up on the runway. And in the eastern Sinai, below the radar horizon, invisible and waiting, the ambush force held its position, engines at minimum power, altimeters reading barely 100 feet above the desert floor. Pilots watching their instruments and listening for the single word that would send them climbing into the morning sky. What happened next would not just end 5 Soviet pilots' careers. It would end an era. The pilots chosen for the bait formation knew the risks. Flying 40 feet from another aircraft at 35,000 feet was not a maneuver, it was a bet against physics. One moment of turbulence, one crosswind, one lapse in concentration, and 2 jets would collide. There would be no ejection, no parachute, just fire and metal spinning toward the desert floor. Captain Amos Amir was 29 years old. He would lead the formation. 3 weeks before the operation, he sat alone in his quarters and wrote a letter, not to his wife, not to his children, to the pilot who would replace him if he did not come back. The separation distance feels impossible, he wrote. Your instinct will tell you to give yourself space. Do not listen. Trust the instruments. Trust the man on your wing. And if something goes wrong, brake hard left. Not right. Left. He sealed the letter, placed it in his desk drawer, and went back to training. The training was brutal. 4 aircraft, flying in formation so tight that Soviet radar would read them as one. Hour after hour, day after day. By the end of 3 weeks, they could hold the formation for 40 minutes without deviation, in clouds, in turbulence, and Amir stopped writing letters. Meanwhile, the ambush force rehearsed their own role. F-4 Phantoms and additional Mirages, flying at 100 feet above the desert floor, threading through terrain gaps that Abraham Anand's team had mapped with obsessive precision, below the minimum elevation angle of Soviet radar. Invisible. Colonel Giora Epstein flew lead Phantom. He had not asked to be part of the operation. He had volunteered, the other pilots noticed. Epstein was not a man who volunteered for anything he did not believe in. One night, in the briefing room after everyone else had left, Epstein found Anand still working. Charts spread across 3 tables. Coffee cold in a paper cup. Epstein stood in the doorway for a moment. If this goes wrong, he said quietly, I will be the first to know. And I will have to live with that. Anand looked up. If it goes wrong, he said, you will not have time to think about it. Epstein almost smiled. You are asking us to trust your calculations completely, to fly into a situation where we cannot adjust, cannot improvise. We execute your plan exactly, or we die, yes. Why should I believe you have thought of everything? Anand turned back to his charts. Because I have thought of nothing else for 8 months. Epstein studied him for a long moment, then he nodded once and left. The next morning he told his squadron, we fly this exactly as briefed, no deviations, no creativity. We trust the plan. Coming from Epstein, that was everything. July 30th, 1970. Dawn broke over the Sinai at 5:47 a.m. The 4 bait Mirages were already airborne. Climbing slowly toward 35,000 feet, formation locked, the ambush force, 8 Phantoms and 8 Mirages, sat low over the eastern Sinai, engines idling, waiting. In the operations room, Anand watched 2 screens simultaneously. One showed the Israeli radar picture, 4 mirages appearing as a single large return. The other showed intercepted Soviet radar feeds. The same picture, one large, slow-moving blip. The deception was holding. At 6:42 am, the bait formation crossed into Egyptian airspace. On Soviet screens, a controller saw what he expected to see, a reconnaissance aircraft, high altitude, slow speed. Unescorted, an easy kill. He reached for the radio. Scramble Falcon flight, single target, Vector 270, Angels 3-5. At a Soviet airfield south of Cairo, 8 MiG-21s spooled up their engines. The flight leader was Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Yurchenko, 31 years old, father of 2, veteran of 847 flight hours. 2 weeks earlier, he had written a letter home to his wife in Kursk. The Israelis are not what Moscow says, he wrote. They are competent, aggressive, but they rely too much on American equipment and not enough on doctrine. When we finally engage them directly, it will be brief. He sealed that letter and sent it home. He would never write another. 6:44 am Yurchenko's flight climbed fast, vectored by ground control toward the large radar return moving north over the Sinai. In his cockpit, Yurchenko listened to the GCI controller's calm, confident voice. Falcon led, target bearing 265, range 40 kilometers. Single contact, large return, assess reconnaissance type. Yurchenko acknowledged, a reconnaissance plane, unescorted. This would be quick. He armed his weapons. His wingmen did the same. 40 kilometers became 30. Then 20. Falcon lead cleared to engage. Yurchenko nosed down slightly, accelerating, and then at a range of 12 kilometers something changed. The large radar return on his scope suddenly split. Not into 2 contacts, into 16. Yurchenko's hand froze on the stick. Ground Falcon lead. I have. He did not finish the sentence. Because at that moment, 8 Israeli Phantoms and 8 Mirages, flying at 500 knots, rose out of the terrain below him, like ghosts materializing from nothing. They had been there the entire time. 100 feet above the desert floor, below Soviet radar coverage, waiting, and now they were climbing, fast, positioning behind and below the Soviet formation. Yurchenko broke hard right, shouted into his radio. Break, break, ambush, but the doctrine that had made Soviet pilots so precise, so effective, also made them predictable. They had been trained to trust the ground, to wait for vectors, to execute commands, not to improvise. And in the 3 seconds it took for the Soviet GCI controller to understand what was happening, to issue new vectors, to coordinate a response, the Israeli pilots had already fired. The engagement lasted 180 seconds. Epstein's Phantom locked onto the trailing MiG in Yurchenko's flight, fired. The missile tracked true. The MiG exploded at 28,000 feet. The pilot never ejected. 2 more MiGs fell to mirages within seconds. Tight turns, guns only, close range. Yurchenko pulled into a desperate climb, trying to gain altitude, trying to create separation. But Amos Amir's Mirage was already there, positioned perfectly. 1 missile, 1 kill. Yurchenko's aircraft disintegrated, pieces tumbling through the morning sky. He was still strapped into his seat when he hit the desert floor. The other Soviet pilots scattered. 2 managed to disengage and run westward toward Egyptian airspace. 3 did not. By 6:47 am, it was over. 5 MiG-21s destroyed, 4 Soviet pilots dead. 1 ejected and was captured. Not a single Israeli aircraft was lost. Epstein's Phantom took minor damage from debris. He landed safely 30 minutes later. In the operations room, Arnon sat very still, watching the radar screen, watching the Soviet contacts disappear one by one. Someone behind him was cheering. He did not turn around. The aftermath came in 3 waves. The first wave was immediate. Israeli military headquarters erupted in celebration. Pilots returned to base. Gun camera footage was reviewed. Confirmations were made. 5 kills, 0 losses. It was by any measure a flawless execution. The second wave came 4 hours later. The American ambassador requested an urgent briefing. The cabinet convened an emergency session, and Abraham Arnon found himself sitting across a conference table from General Mordecai Hod, whose expression communicated something very specific. He was not pleased. "You killed Soviet pilots," Hod said. "Not a question. A statement." Arnon kept his voice level. "We killed Soviet pilots who were flying active combat missions against Israeli aircraft over disputed airspace." The engagement was within the parameters approved by this command. Hod leaned forward. The parameters approved by this command did not anticipate 5 confirmed kills in 3 minutes with gun camera footage that the entire world will eventually see. You have handed Moscow a crisis, and us a target. He was not wrong. The immediate problem was not military, it was political. Soviet leadership could not publicly acknowledge that their pilots had been flying combat missions in Egypt. Officially, they were advisors, technicians, consultants. Acknowledging the losses meant acknowledging the lie. But not responding meant absorbing a humiliation in front of every nation watching the Cold War play out in the Middle East. The third wave was silence. For 72 hours, Moscow said nothing. No official statement, no diplomatic protest, no military response, just silence, and that silence was more dangerous than any threat. August 19, 1970. A Soviet Il-76 transport aircraft landed at Beni Suef Air Base in Egypt. 8 men disembarked, all specialists, all carrying equipment that filled 3 cargo pallets. Their leader was Colonel Dmitry Volkov, 42 years old, doctorate in radar systems from the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy. His mission was precise: analyze the electromagnetic signature of every Israeli aircraft incursion since July 1st. Identify the technical parameters of the deception used on July 30th. Design countermeasures that would make a repeat operation impossible. Volkov was not a pilot, he was a physicist, and he had been studying formation radar cross-section manipulation since 1963. He had written his doctoral dissertation on it, published papers arguing that tight multi-aircraft formations could theoretically deceive ground-based radar systems. He had published those papers 7 years before Abraham Arnon used the technique operationally. When Israeli signals intelligence picked up Volkov's name within 72 hours of his arrival, the intercept went directly to Arnon's desk. Arnon read it 3 times, then he sat very still, because he understood immediately what it meant. The Soviets had not sent a technician. They had sent the one man on Earth who had already solved the theoretical problem that Arnon had turned into a tactical reality. Volkov already knew it was possible. He just had not known anyone would actually do it. Volkov moved with impressive speed. Within 5 days of arrival, his team had reconstructed from radar tape analysis the approximate formation geometry used by the 4 Israeli Mirages on July 30th. Within 10 days, they had modified Soviet GCI software parameters to flag any radar return showing cross-section variance inconsistent with known single aircraft profiles. The specific signature that Arnon's formation had exploited, the oversized blip that had looked so perfectly like a reconnaissance aircraft, was now a trigger for immediate suspicion rather than immediate intercept. Soviet patrol behavior changed visibly. MiG-21s began flying in 2-ship formations instead of 4-ship stacks, reducing their own radar cross-section, making them harder to trap. Response times to radar contacts dropped from 4 minutes to under 90 seconds. And every intercept was now preceded by a mandatory visual confirmation request. Pilots were required to make positive visual identification before engaging. The pure radar-vectored attack that had delivered them into the ambush on July 30th was effectively eliminated. In 30 days, Volkov had rebuilt the Soviet air defense architecture over the Suez Canal almost from scratch. Arnon watched it happen through his signals intercepts and felt something that he later described as genuine professional admiration mixed with considerable alarm. September 3, 1970. An Israeli Phantom on a low-altitude reconnaissance mission along the eastern Sinai clipped a ridge while threading one of the terrain gaps that Arnon's team had mapped for the original operation. The pilot ejected safely, the aircraft was destroyed, and within hours the incident had become the centerpiece of a formal complaint filed by the Phantom squadron commander. The complaint argued that Arnon's low-altitude routing protocols had created an unacceptable operational risk. The complaint went to Hod's office. Hod forwarded it to the Intelligence Directorate with a request for a formal review. The formal review convened on September 8th, 3 senior Air Force officers, none of whom had been involved in planning Operation Rimon 20, none of whom were inclined toward charitable interpretation. The lead reviewer was Brigadier General Eleazar Cohen. He opened the session with a question that was not really a question. How many aircraft have we lost to your terrain threading routes since July 30th? 1, Arnon said. How many kills against Soviet pilots since July 30th? Arnon held Cohen's gaze. 0. Cohen sat down his folder. So we have lost an aircraft to a root structure that no longer works against an enemy that has adapted and is now flying more aggressively than before your operation. Explain to me what we gained. It was a fair question. It was also, Arnon believed, the wrong question, because what Operation Remon 20 had actually achieved was not measurable in kill ratios. It was measurable in something far more important: Soviet decision-making. The losses on July 30th had fundamentally changed the risk calculation inside Soviet command in Egypt. The expansion that hardliners had proposed, moving the Red Line westward, authorizing unrestricted engagement, had been rejected in Moscow, partly because of the losses, partly because of the demonstrated ability of Israeli forces to create conditions that Soviet doctrine could not predict. The Soviets were flying more defensively, flying faster and higher, flying less time over the canal zone. The Red Line had not moved, it had effectively contracted. Arnon said all of this to Cohen, precisely, methodically. With supporting data from 30 days of signals intercepts, Cohen listened without expression. Then he said, "You have 2 weeks to show me what comes next. If you do not have something operational in 2 weeks, this review board recommends suspending your authority pending full assessment." 2 weeks. Volkov had 8 specialists and full Soviet analytical resources. Arnon had his team, his manuals, and a new idea that he had not yet shared with anyone. He went back to his operations room and began working. The idea was different from anything he had tried before. Where Operation Remon 20 had used formation geometry to deceive radar, the new concept used emission timing, or rather, the complete absence of it. Every Israeli aircraft carried radar and communication equipment that broadcast specific electronic signatures during normal operation. Volkov's team had catalogued those signatures from 30 days of intercepts. They now knew what an Israeli Mirage looked like electronically, what a Phantom sounded like on frequency, what a standard Israeli patrol package emitted. What if the ambush force emitted nothing? Complete electronic silence, no radar, no radio, no F transponder, aircraft flying as pure kinetic objects, invisible to every electromagnetic sensor the Soviets had positioned along the canal. Navigation entirely by terrain reference and pre-programmed timing. The strike would arrive not as a radar return or an intercepted frequency, but as something Soviet doctrine had almost no framework for. Physical presence without electronic warning. The risk was severe. Without radar or radio, pilots could not communicate, could not receive abort signals, could not be warned of threats. They could not see themselves. If anything changed after launch, they would not know. They would fly their pre-planned route to the precise second and execute. Regardless, Arnon briefed it to Epstein on September 14th. Epstein was quiet for a very long time after the briefing ended. Then he said, "You want my pilots to fly combat missions with no radio and no radar?" "Yes." If something goes wrong, they execute the abort maneuver at the pre-planned coordinates and return on the pre-planned route. They will have everything they need before launch. After launch, they fly the plan. Epstein looked at the route map for a long time. He looked at the timing sequences. He looked at the terrain elevation profiles that Arnon's team had spent 10 days refining. "How confident are you?" Arnon met his eyes. "More confident than I was before July 30th. And we both know how that went. Epstein nodded slowly. "Then we fly it. September 18th, 1970. 4 Israeli aircraft lifted off from Hatzor Air Base in complete electronic silence. No radar emissions, no radio traffic. IFF transponders off. They flew southeast at 200 feet above the desert floor, threading the terrain gaps that Arnon's team had mapped. Invisible to every Soviet and Egyptian sensor along the canal. Colonel Volkov's team saw nothing. The radar screens were clean. The frequency monitors were silent. In the GCI center at Beni Suef, controllers watched their scopes and saw a quiet morning over the Sinai. The 4 aircraft crossed the canal at 6:51 a.m. They climbed at 6:54. Fast, silent, no warning. 2 Soviet MiG-21s are en route 8,000 feet, had no electronic warning, no GCI vector, no radar indication of threat. The first indication they received was visual. two Israeli aircraft appearing below and behind them at a range of less than 2 miles, already in firing position. 2 MiGs were destroyed in 40 seconds. The other two in the patrol broke and ran westward. The Israeli aircraft descended immediately, dropped back to low altitude, and flew the pre-planned return route in complete silence. They landed at Hatzor at 7:23 am total time from takeoff to landing, 91 minutes, electronic emissions during the entire operation 0. When Arnon walked into Cohen's office that afternoon and placed the gun camera footage on the desk, Cohen looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up. How? They could not see what was not there. Cohen studied him. Volkov will figure this out too, eventually. Yes, Arnon said, but not today. And that, in the end, was enough. August 7th, 1970, 8 days after Operation Riemann 20, Egypt and Israel agreed to a ceasefire brokered by the United States. The shooting stopped along the Suez Canal, but ceasefires in the Middle East were rarely absolute. Violations were common, patrols continued, and both sides tested the boundaries of what the agreement actually meant. The September 18th operation had been one of those tests, and in the 2 weeks that followed, Soviet patrol activity over the Suez Canal dropped by 40%. Colonel Volkov's team filed an urgent report to Moscow. The language was technical, clinical, but the conclusion was unmistakable. Israeli forces had demonstrated an electronic warfare capability that existing Soviet doctrine had no framework to counter. The report recommended a fundamental review of GCI dependency in contested electromagnetic environments. That review would take months. By the time it concluded, the war was over. Soviet pilots stopped flying combat missions. Volkov's team packed their equipment and eventually went home. The numbers told a specific story. Between March and July 1970, the Soviet-backed air defense system had shot down 6 Israeli aircraft and effectively shut down deep penetration operations over Egypt. After July 30th, Israeli losses to Soviet-directed systems dropped to 0 for the remainder of the conflict. The red line, which had seemed permanent in June, effectively ceased to function as a constraint by September. The war of attrition was over, and Abraham Arnon received a commendation that was classified. His name did not appear in any public account of the operation for more than 20 years. There was no ceremony, no public recognition. Arnon went back to his desk, back to his manuals, back to his signals intercepts, and began working on the next problem. The officers who had doubted him, who had called the plan reckless, who had warned about World War III, received promotions that were visible. Assignments that were public. They appeared in newspaper photographs. Gave speeches at Air Force ceremonies. They had been wrong about Operation Riemann 20. They had been wrong about the September operation, and their careers continued upward regardless. Because in large institutions, being wrong about the right things leaves fewer marks than being right about the wrong ones. Colonel Giora Epstein was promoted to full colonel 6 months later. He gave an interview to a military journal about Israeli Air Force tactics and innovation. He did not mention Arnon's name, not out of malice, not out of deliberate omission. But because the operation remained classified, and Epstein was following the rules, still Arnon read the interview, noted the absence, and felt nothing that resembled bitterness. The work was the recognition, he said years later, when the classification had been partially lifted, understanding how the system worked, finding the gap, proving the concept, that was complete in itself. A medal in a drawer that nobody can see changes nothing about whether the idea was correct, but the people who knew, knew. The young analyst Arnon trained carried his methods forward. The pilots who flew the missions understood what he had built, and the doctrine he developed in that operations room did not stay in the Sinai. October 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Egyptian and Syrian forces employed Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles with devastating effectiveness in the opening days, shooting down dozens of Israeli aircraft, demonstrating that the lessons of 1970 had not been fully institutionalized. The Israeli Air Force, accustomed to operating with relative freedom, flew into one of the densest air defense environments in history and suffered catastrophic losses in the first 72 hours. 40 aircraft lost in 3 days. The number still carries weight, but embedded within the eventual Israeli recovery, the gradual suppression of Egyptian and Syrian air defenses that turned the war's trajectory by its second week were tactics that traced directly back to Arnon's operations room work. The use of decoy drones to saturate and exhaust radar-guided missile batteries, the employment of electronic jamming coordinated with physical strike packages, the fundamental principle of making air defense systems respond to what you wanted them to see rather than what was actually there. Those techniques, refined through 3 years of classified analysis that Arnon and his team had conducted after the ceasefire, saved Israeli aircraft in October 1973. In ways that were never publicly attributed, but were understood internally by the people doing the work. The technical legacy traveled farther than anyone anticipated. American planners studying the 1970 engagements drew specific conclusions. Conclusions that fed directly into the development of what would become suppression of enemy air defenses doctrine, SEAD, the idea that you could defeat an integrated air defense network not by flying faster or higher, but by understanding and exploiting the assumptions embedded in its design. That insight has Arnon's fingerprints on it, even when his name never appears in the documents. 35 nations currently operate air defense suppression doctrines that incorporate principles first demonstrated operationally over the Suez Canal in the summer of 1970. What Arnon proved with 4 mirages and a slide rule is now embedded in the design philosophy of the F-35, in stealth aircraft design, in drone swarm tactics, and in the electronic warfare suites of aircraft that cost more than some countries' entire defense budgets. The principle has not changed. The tools have simply become more expensive. What has also not changed is the resistance. Every generation of military institution produces the equivalent of the officers who told Arnon his plan would start World War III. Every large organization, military or civilian, contains the structural incentive to protect existing doctrine against ideas that challenge it. The officers who called Operation Riemann 20 reckless were not stupid men. They were men whose careers had been built on a specific understanding of how air warfare worked, and Arnon's idea required them to accept that their understanding had a gap they had not seen. That is the hardest thing to accept in any institution, not that the enemy is clever, that your own assumptions are wrong. The story of Operation Riemann 20 is not fundamentally a story about radar. It is a story about the difference between confidence and knowledge. The Soviet pilots who flew into the ambush on July 30th were genuinely skilled. They were brave men, operating excellent aircraft with considerable experience. What defeated them was not inferior skill. It was the assumption that confidence in a system constituted knowledge of its limits. They trusted the radar because the radar had always been correct before. They followed the doctrine because the doctrine had always worked before. They flew into a geometry they did not understand because no one had ever made them understand it. Arnon's entire method was built on asking one question that the Soviets had stopped asking. What does this system assume, and what happens when that assumption is wrong? Now here is the detail that almost nobody knows, the one that remained classified until 2019, when Israeli military archives declassified a specific tranche of documents from the 1970 operations. Among the materials in that release was a Soviet document, a captured Soviet document. Specifically, it was a partial transcript of an internal briefing delivered by Colonel Dmitry Volkov to Soviet Air Force headquarters in Moscow in November 1970. 3 months after the ceasefire. In that briefing, Volkov described Operation Riemann 20 in precise technical detail. He described the formation geometry, the radar cross-section manipulation, the terrain threading approach corridors. He had reconstructed the entire operation from radar tapes and physical evidence. His analysis was, according to Israeli intelligence officers who reviewed the document after its declassification, essentially correct in every significant detail. But the final paragraph of the document contains something unexpected. After his technical analysis, Volkov wrote, the Israeli success in this operation was not primarily a function of technological superiority or tactical innovation. It was a function of a willingness to think about our own system from the outside, which we do not currently train our officers to do. Until we develop that capacity, we remain vulnerable to opponents who do. Volkov had understood exactly what had happened. He had written it down clearly in a document delivered to Soviet military leadership in 1970, and Soviet air doctrine did not substantively incorporate his recommendation for another 15 years. The document was captured, how and when remains redacted in the declassified version, but it sat in Israeli intelligence archives for 49 years. Abraham Arnan, by the time of its declassification, was 83 years old. Living quietly in Tel Aviv, retired, no longer working in intelligence. Whether he ever read it, whether he knew that his most dangerous opponent had in the end arrived at exactly the same conclusion he had, is not recorded in any official file. But 3 people who knew Arnan personally reported that in the last year of his life he seemed more at peace than he had ever been, as if some question he had been carrying for decades had finally been answered. From a borrowed desk in an operations room, working from captured manuals and intercepted radio logs, one analyst with no combat flight hours designed 2 operations that destroyed 7 Soviet combat aircraft, dismantled the Red Line over the Suez Canal, and fundamentally altered the trajectory of Soviet air power in the Middle East. The doctrines he developed in that room are still flying today. In aircraft he never imagined, over conflicts he never anticipated, operated by pilots who have never heard his name. 5 jets fell in 3 minutes on July 30th, 1970. The lesson they taught is still being learned, because here is what Arnan understood, and what Volkov eventually understood, and what every military planner who studied those engagements came to understand. The greatest weapon ever built is not made of metal. It is made of a question that the other side stopped asking. And in the right hands, at the right moment, that question is enough to change everything. What does this system assume? And what happens when that assumption is wrong? Those 2 questions. Simple, direct, unforgiving. They destroyed 5 MiG-21s in 180 seconds. They ended a war. They built a doctrine that spans generations. And they remain, to this day, the most dangerous weapons any military force can deploy, not because they destroy equipment, but because they destroy certainty. And in war, as in life, certainty is the most dangerous illusion of all. Abraham Arnan died in 2022 at the age of 86. His obituary in the Israeli press mentioned that he had worked in military intelligence. It did not mention Operation Rimon 20. It did not mention the 2 operations he designed in 1970. It did not mention that his ideas are embedded in the operational doctrine of 35 air forces worldwide, because some stories are too important to be contained in obituaries. They are written in the sky, in the tactics that kept pilots alive, in the questions that destroyed certainty, in the quiet certainty of a man who understood that being right was not the same as being recognized. And who did the work anyway? If you know a story like this, an unrecognized person who changed something important with an idea that everyone called impossible, remember it. These are the stories that deserve to be told, the ones where the victory was not in the medal or the promotion or the newspaper photograph, but in the question that nobody else thought to ask, and the courage to trust the answer even when everyone else said it was impossible.